The sprawling skyline of New York stretched endlessly beyond the towering glass walls of Alexander Hayes's office. Below, the city pulsed with life, cars speeding through avenues, people rushing to catch trains, but none of it reached him. The view that once made him feel on top of the world now felt distant and hollow. He stood motionless, his reflection in the glass a ghost of the man he used to be. Behind him, his phone buzzed again, a reminder from his assistant about yet another nanny application. He sighed heavily. 5 months, 6 nannies. Each one had left, leaving his son Liam more withdrawn and isolated than before. The departures weren't just failures. They were cracks widening in the carefully constructed walls of his life. "Mr. Hayes, your 7 o'clock is here." Miss Carter, the voice of his assistant, crackled through the intercom. Alexander adjusted his tie, a reflexive gesture he hadn't shaken after years of corporate discipline. "Send her in," he replied flatly. The heavy office doors opened, and Sophie Carter stepped inside. Her presence was unexpectedly calming, yet not what he had envisioned. There was no immaculate power suit, no forced formality. Instead, Sophie wore a simple navy dress that suggested ease and practicality. Her dark curls were neatly pulled back, and her warm, attentive eyes met Alexander's directly, without hesitation. "Thank you for meeting me at this hour, Mr. Hayes," she said with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. Alexander gestured for Sophie to sit in the chair across from his desk. He picked up the file from his desk, flipping through the information his assistant had prepared. "Your references are impressive, Miss Carter," he said, his tone neutral but probing. "However, I see that you've moved between several positions over the past few years." "I have," Sophie replied calmly. She sat straight, exuding quiet confidence without a hint of arrogance. "I believe in starting any work relationship with honesty. I typically work with families during periods of transition, divorce, loss, or other major changes. I stay until the children find stability, until the families regain their footing, and then I move on." Her words unsettled Alexander. His jaw tightened as he responded in a firm tone. "We are not a transitional family, Ms. Carter. We're not broken. I just need someone reliable to care for my son while I work." A slight smile curved Sophie's lips. "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, your son has had 6 different caregivers in 5 months. That does suggest a transition of some kind, doesn't it?" Her directness hit Alexander like a jolt. Most previous candidates had carefully sidestepped the truth to avoid risking the generous salary. Yet, there was no judgment in Sophie's eyes, only a deep understanding that made him uncomfortable. "Tell me about Liam," she gently shifted the conversation. "What does he love? What makes him laugh?" Alexander faltered. He didn't know the answer. When was the last time he had heard his son laugh? After a moment of silence, he replied mechanically, "Liam is quiet and well-behaved. He needs structure and consistency." "All children do," Sophie agreed, nodding. "But they also need joy, Mr. Hayes, adventure, the freedom to express themselves, to be messy and loud sometimes." Alexander remained silent, his fingers unconsciously twisting the wedding ring still on his finger. "I appreciate your philosophy, but I need someone to maintain order in my household, not revolutionize it," he finally said. Sophie stood, smoothing her dress. "Mr. Hayes, if you're looking for someone to keep Liam quiet and out of your way, I'm not the right person for the job." She turned to leave. "Wait," Alexander called after her, almost involuntarily. Sophie paused, her hand on the door handle. "He likes dinosaurs," Alexander said quietly. "He has this old stuffed dinosaur he carries everywhere. I'm not even sure where it came from. Sometimes I hear him whispering to it at night, telling it about his day." Sophie turned around, her gaze soft. "Thank you for telling me that," she said gently. Alexander sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. "The position is yours, if you want it," he finally said, his voice weary. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the Hayes mansion precisely on time. As she stepped inside, she was escorted to Alexander's study, where Liam sat curled up in a large leather chair, clutching his familiar stuffed dinosaur tightly. Sophie knelt gently to his eye level. "Good morning, Liam. I'm Sophie," she greeted softly. "Your dad told me you're quite the dinosaur expert. Is that true?" Liam glanced up at her, then quickly looked over at Alexander, as if seeking reassurance. He didn't reply, but his grip on the stuffed dinosaur loosened slightly. "Would you like to show me your room?" Sophie continued with a warm smile. Liam hesitated for a moment before giving a small nod. Alexander stood awkwardly, unsure of his role. Sophie smiled and turned to him. "I think Liam might feel more comfortable if you joined us. Just for a few minutes." Alexander reflexively checked his watch, prompting Liam to shrink into himself, clearly anticipating rejection. But this time, Alexander hesitated before answering. "Of course. Lead the way, buddy." Surprise flickered across Liam's face, and his eyes brightened slightly. He quickly slid off the chair and led them both upstairs. His bedroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the mansion. Unlike the cold, polished luxury of the house, this room exploded with color and imagination. Dinosaur posters covered the walls, and an intricate Lego dinosaur model dominated a small table. "Did you build this yourself?" Sophie asked, stepping closer to admire the structure. Liam nodded and whispered, "It's an Allosaurus." "Incredible," Alexander breathed, genuinely impressed. He realized he had never paid close attention to his son's room before. "Maybe you could show me how to build more dinosaurs," Sophie suggested with a gentle smile. "Though I bet you're way better at it than I am." Liam's eyes widened with surprise and excitement. "Dad helped me build this before. But that was before," he trailed off, his voice tinged with suppressed emotion. Alexander's heart clenched as he watched his son struggle to hold back the pain of their shared loss. "Maybe we can build something new together," Sophie suggested softly. A radiant smile broke across Liam's face, the first Alexander had seen in many long months. Alexander entered his study after hours and found Sophie standing silently before the wall of old photos of Isabel. Her eyes were fixed on a picture of Isabel smiling at the beach, lost in thought. "How do you know about these photos?" Alexander asked, his voice colder than usual. Sophie flinched slightly and turned to face him. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just thinking about her." "Isabel," she replied hesitantly. Alexander stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. "You know too much about my wife. How do you know all these details?" Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I used to be a doctor at the hospital in Boston. I was the one on call when Isabel was brought in after her accident." Alexander froze, the words striking him like a physical blow. His breath came out in ragged gasps. You were there? You were her doctor?" He choked out, barely able to form the question. Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with guilt. "I couldn't save her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But there's more. It wasn't an accident. Someone cut her brake lines." The world tilted violently around him. Alexander stumbled back, clutching the desk for support. His chest heaved as the weight of Sophie's words crushed down on him. No, you're telling me someone murdered my wife?" His voice cracked, filled with disbelief and rising fury. Sophie met his gaze steadily. "Yes, David Reed." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, Alexander could do nothing but stare at her, his mind refusing to process the betrayal. Alexander felt the room spin around him. "You're saying it was a setup? Who would do that?" "David Reed," Sophie answered, her tone hardening as she said the name. "Your CFO. Isabel found evidence of illegal transactions in the company accounts. She had scheduled a meeting with your lawyers the day of the crash." Alexander stumbled back a step, struggling to breathe. "David! No, that's impossible. He's my friend." "Sometimes the worst betrayal comes from those we trust the most," Sophie said quietly. "Why are you here, Sophie?" Alexander demanded after a long pause. "I wanted justice for Isabel," she replied, her voice trembling. "I spent 5 years investigating the truth, but after meeting Liam and you, I didn't just want revenge anymore. I wanted to protect you both." Alexander sank into a chair, his mind racing with the weight of the revelations. He looked at Sophie with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "I need time to process all of this," he sighed. "But I know one thing. David will pay for what he did." "You won't have to face him alone," Sophie said firmly. "I'll be here to help you see this through." The following day, Alexander entered the boardroom exactly on time, his expression unreadable. In his briefcase, he carried the evidence Sophie had given him, His footsteps echoed in the tense silence of the room. David Reed stood to greet him, offering a forced smile. "Alexander, I was starting to worry. We need to discuss the expansion plans in Asia." Alexander gave a curt nod and motioned for him to sit. "Before we discuss Asia, I believe the board members should review some crucial documents," he announced, pulling a file from his briefcase. He spoke clearly, his voice steady and cold. 5 years ago, my wife, Isabel Hayes, discovered a series of illegal financial transactions within the company accounts. She intended to present her findings to our legal team. He paused, locking eyes with David, who had gone pale. But she never made it to that meeting. Instead, she died in what I now know was a staged accident. The room fell into stunned silence. The board members exchanged shocked glances. David stood abruptly, his face pale and glistening with sweat. The confidence he had worn for years cracked like fragile glass. "Alexander, this is ridiculous. You're bringing up something buried for years. The board isn't going to believe these accusations." "Sit down, David," Alexander commanded, his voice low and deadly. The room fell into tense silence. "The police already have everything," Alexander continued, his tone razor-sharp. "Wire transfers, forged accident reports, the bribes you thought no one would uncover." David's eyes widened in panic. He stumbled back a step, his gaze darting to the board members around him. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "I was protecting the company." The boardroom doors burst open, and officers entered. David's desperation turned to outright terror as they moved to arrest him. David's face drained of all color as the boardroom doors burst open and officers stepped in. His eyes darted around desperately, seeking an escape that didn't exist. The doors to the boardroom burst open as a team of officers entered. David panicked, but was quickly restrained and handcuffed on the spot. As he was being led past Alexander, David sneered bitterly. "I did this to protect the company. Isabel would have destroyed everything." Alexander met his gaze without flinching. "No, David, you destroyed everything that truly mattered." When the meeting concluded, Alexander stepped out of the building, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Justice had been served. But he knew this was only the beginning of a long journey toward healing the wounds of the past. After the board meeting concluded, Alexander didn't return to the office. Instead, he drove straight to the cemetery. He stopped in front of Isabel's grave, where fresh flowers adorned the stone, likely Regina's doing. Alexander sat beside the headstone, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. "I hope you'd understand," he murmured softly. "About Sophie, about everything. You always wanted me to find someone who could help me live again, not just survive." The gentle rustling of the trees around him seemed to whisper in response. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a shift, like the weight of his grief was loosening, even if only slightly. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a photo from Sophie. In it, Liam stood proudly before a towering dinosaur skeleton, his face glowing with excitement. The caption read, "Saving the best facts for you. Take your time. We'll be here." A bittersweet smile crept onto Alexander's face. Maybe, he thought, healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but finding the strength to live for the ones who were still here. Alexander smiled through his tears. "You'd love him, Isabel. He's got your curiosity and courage." He stood, touching the headstone one last time before walking away. At the museum, Sophie and Liam were exploring the prehistoric marine life exhibit. Liam spoke animatedly about marine reptiles, drawing a small crowd of curious children. When he spotted Alexander, his face lit up. "Dad, did you know mosasaurus babies are born in the water? They have special flippers," he exclaimed, then hesitated. "But maybe Sophie can explain it better." "No way," Alexander chuckled, lifting his son into his arms. "I want to hear it all from you." They spent the afternoon wandering through the exhibits. Liam's laughter echoed through the halls, banishing the weight of past memories. Sophie watched them, her eyes soft with quiet affection, noting how much both father and son had changed. After leaving the museum, they stopped at an ice cream parlor near Central Park. Liam eagerly chose chocolate ice cream with dinosaur-shaped sprinkles. As he finished, he asked, "Can we walk through the park and look for more dinosaur footprints?" Alexander glanced at his watch, remembering his pending meetings, but when he saw the hopeful gleam in his son's eyes and Sophie's gentle nod of encouragement, he smiled. "Lead the way, buddy." They strolled along the familiar park path. Though it was the same route they had taken many times before, everything felt different now. "I received an offer from Boston General," Sophie said quietly. "They want me to head their department." Alexander stopped walking, his chest tightening. "When do they need an answer?" "Tomorrow," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "And what will you tell them?" Sophie looked at Liam running ahead and then turned to face Alexander. "I already told them. I said no." Alexander stared at her in shock. "You turned it down. That's a huge opportunity." "I found what I need here," she said softly. "My family is here. You and Liam. You're everything." Alexander gently took her hand, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. "I love you," he whispered. "We've both been through so much, but you've given this family something I never thought we'd have again. Hope." That evening, after Liam had fallen asleep, Alexander and Sophie sat together in the living room. New photos filled with laughter and joy now adorned the walls alongside the old ones of Isabel. The room, once cold and sterile, had become a space filled with warmth and life. "I have an idea," Sophie said softly, her hand brushing over one of the photo frames. "We could turn this room into a family memory space. Keep Isabel's photos, but add new ones beside them, something that connects the past and the present." Alexander glanced around the room, sensing the completeness it now radiated. He smiled gently and nodded. "I think Isabel would love that." They stood quietly, side by side, basking in the peace that had settled after all the turmoil. "I think you're ready to start writing a new chapter in your life," Alexander said, looking at her with unwavering trust. "Not just me," Sophie replied softly, taking his hand. They stepped out into the garden, the cool night air carrying the distant hum of the city. Stars scattered across the sky, silent witnesses to the path they had walked. Sophie leaned into Alexander's side. "Do you think we can really move forward?" she whispered. Alexander took a deep breath, gazing up at the stars. "We don't forget, but we learn to carry it, and with time, we build something new, something stronger." Their hands intertwined, a silent promise exchanged under the night sky. For the first time in years, Alexander felt whole.